It was early in the morning when the messenger arrived, his face pale and tight with fear. I could see it before he even spoke, that peculiar look of a man who had witnessed something he did not understand, something that gnawed at the edges of his sanity. His words were brief but loaded with an unsettling urgency. A remote village, nestled in the foothills near the gray mountains, had fallen silent. Its people had disappeared without a trace, leaving only strange noises, scraping, rumbling, and distant groaning from beneath the earth. No one dared approach the village since. Reports like these, the ones that stir superstition and fear, often find their way to my desk. In my years as a scholar of the Empire, I've learned to sift through the wild tales of peasants and the exaggerated reports of patrolmen. But something about the way the messenger's voice trembled, unnerved me. And so, despite the growing storm that threatened to tear through the southern hills, I gathered what I needed and set out toward the village. The journey was long, and as I approached, the sky seemed to mirror the growing dread in my chest. Dark clouds hung low over the landscape, and the wind carried a strange sound like a distant groaning, deep and buried, as if the earth itself was in pain. The air felt heavy, oppressive. It wasn't long before I saw at the outskirts of the village. It was deathly quiet. The first few houses I passed were empty, their doors hanging open, belongings scattered across the ground as if the inhabitants had fled in a hurry. There was no sign of life. Not even the birds dared to perch on the rooftops. The wind pushed against me, carrying with it a faint scraping sound. I couldn't place it, but it seemed to come from below. Always below. I reached the center of the village, a clearing where once there must have been a bustling market, judging by the broken carts and abandoned stalls, but now it was desolate. I called out, though I knew no one would answer. My voice echoed back to me, hollow and mocking. That's when I saw it. Where the heart of the village should have been, there was only a gaping hole in the earth. It was massive, far larger than anything natural. The ground around it was cracked, jagged, as if the village had simply been pulled into the abyss by some invisible force. And from the depths of that hole came the noise of scraping, rumbling sound that set my teeth on edge, as if something ancient and malevolent was stirring below. I approached the edge of the hole cautiously, peering into the darkness. The wind seemed to push harder against me the closer I got, almost as if it were trying to keep me away. But I pressed on. There was something down there. I could feel it. The depth of the hole was immeasurable, and it seemed to go on forever. The faint green glow of warpstone flickered deep within, illuminating the jagged walls of the pit. I kneeled at the edge and let a small stone tumble into the darkness. The scraping noise below intensified, as though whatever was down there had noticed me. My heart raced. I backed away quickly, every instinct screaming at me to leave, to run. But the village was gone. These people, men, women, children, had been swallowed by the earth, and I needed to know what had happened to them. If this hole was connected to what I feared, the consequences would be dire for all the Empire. I couldn't leave. Not yet. With a final glance into the pit, I steeled myself. Tomorrow I would return with the proper equipment. I would descend into the depths and uncover the truth of this mystery. But even as I made that decision, the sound of scraping from the hole below grew louder, more frantic, as if something was waiting for me to make that very choice. I left the village at dusk, my mind heavy with dread. The wind howled behind me, carrying with it the unmistakable sound of claws scraping against stone, like the earth itself was alive and hungry. The following morning, the air was heavy with the promise of a storm. But it wasn't the sky I feared, it was the gaping maw of earth waiting in the center of that cursed village. I had returned with ropes and lanterns, a crude but necessary means of descent. The villagers were gone, their fates likely sealed in whatever dark abyss lay beneath. The question was, by what hand? As I stood at the edge of the hole, staring down into its vast blackness, I couldn't help but feel as though the ground itself was watching me. The scraping sound persisted, faint but unmistakable, like claws raking across stone. echoing from deep below. I could see the warpstone glimmer in the depths, casting faint green glows along the jagged walls. The sight of it made my skin crawl, but there was no turning back now. With every knot in my rope tested and my lantern flickering dimly, I began my descent. The walls of the hole were uneven, twisted in unnatural ways, as though the very earth had been rent open by monstrous hands. As I descended, the wind above faded into the distance, replaced by an eerie silence punctuated by that endless, rhythmic scraping. I paused, hanging by the rope, the weight of the void pressing in around me. I swung the lantern below, hoping to catch a glimpse of the bottom, but all I saw were jagged rock formations stretching downward, endlessly. The green warpstone glowed faintly along the walls, twisted veins running through the rock like some malignant infection. At last, after what felt like hours, my feet touched the ground. The air was damp, oppressive, and the silence was palpable. I had entered a cavern of sorts, wide and hollow, the ceiling lost in the dark above me. The scraping noise was louder now, reverberating through the stone. My eyes adjusted to the dim glow of warpstone veins running along the walls, casting the entire cavern in an unnatural green light. As I took a step forward, my boot crunched on something brittle. I knelt down to examine it, holding the lantern close. Bones. Human bones. Dozens of them scattered across the ground in no particular order, as though they had been tossed aside like refuse. My stomach churned, but I forced myself to press on. I had to know what had happened here. The cavern led into a series of tunnels, narrow and winding, the walls rough and jagged. There were claw marks everywhere, deep scratches gouged into the stone, as though some monstrous creatures had burrowed their way through the earth. The air felt thick, stale, and with every step I took, the scraping noise seemed to follow me, just at the edge of my hearing. Then I saw evidence of the village. A torn piece of cloth, half buried in the dirt, and beyond that, a broken cartwheel, splintered and crushed. My pulse quickened. The villagers had been taken down here. But why? And by what? I followed the tunnel deeper, every nerve in my body screaming at me to turn back. But the deeper I went, the clearer the truth became. This was no natural cave. This was something far worse. Suddenly, the tunnel opened into a vast underground chamber, and what I saw nearly made me drop the lantern. The ground sloped downward into a pit, and in the center of that pit was a sprawling warren, a nest of filth and twisted machinery. The air was thick with the smell of rot and waste, and from every corner of the chamber, glowing red eyes stared back at me. The Skaven. They were real. The verminous creatures of legend, the rat men that no sane scholar had ever dared believe in. And yet there were hundreds of them, scurrying about the warren, clawing at the earth, digging deeper, scraping away at the stone with sharp, gnarled claws. Some wore filthy, tattered robes, others were armored in rusted metal plates, and all of them carried tools or crude weapons. They moved like shadows, fast and erratic, their red eyes glowing in the dark like embers. The noise, the endless scraping, was them, digging, burrowing, expanding their monstrous empire beneath the earth. The sheer scale of it was horrifying. These weren't just scavengers, they were builders, creators of something vast and terrible. I crouched behind a rock, trying to steady my breath as I watched them. My mind raced. What were they doing? What had happened to the villagers? My question was soon answered. In the center of the warren, surrounded by twisted machinery and warped structures, lay the remains of the villagers. Their bodies were piled in a grotesque heap, many of them mangled beyond recognition, their limbs twisted at unnatural angles. The Skaven were feeding on them, dragging the bodies into the shadows to be devoured or used for some other unspeakable purpose. I felt my stomach churn, bile rising in my throat. The sheer horror of what I was witnessing was almost too much to bear. The Skaven were not just scavengers, they were predators, and they were far more organized, far more dangerous than I had ever imagined. Suddenly, the scraping stopped. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The Skaven had sensed something. Their red eyes scanned the chamber, their noses twitching, as if they could smell my fear. One of the larger ones, clad in rusted armor and wielding a jagged blade, raised its head and let out a low, guttural hiss. They knew I was there. I didn't wait for them to find me. I turned and ran, scrambling back through the tunnel as fast as my legs could carry me. The sound of claws scraping against stone filled the air behind me, growing louder and more frantic. They were coming. My lantern flickered, and for a brief moment, I was plunged into darkness. I stumbled, falling hard against the wall, the rough stone scraping my skin. The scraping noise was deafening now, echoing all around me as the Skaven closed in. I barely made it back to the cavern where I had descended. My hands fumbled with the rope, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I pulled myself upward. The scraping continued, growing louder, closer. I didn't dare look back. When I finally reached the surface, I collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air. The hole loomed behind me, dark and silent once more, but I knew what lay beneath. The Skaven were real, and they were digging. I lay there on the ground, my chest heaving, and the world spun around me. Every breath was a struggle, and for a moment, I believed I had escaped the nightmare below. But as I forced myself to rise, I realized the scraping had not ceased. It had grown fainter, true, but it was still there, still echoing from the darkness. Worse still, I felt something stirring beneath the earth, a tremor, barely perceptible, but unmistakable. They weren't done with me yet. I scrambled to my feet, my heart racing, and glanced back at the yawning abyss. The hole I had descended now felt like a living thing, breathing with malice. The faint green glow of warpstone still flickered from the depths, casting long, distorted shadows on the jagged walls. That infernal scraping continued, louder now, as if the Skaven were clawing their way toward the surface, toward me. I couldn't stay. They would be on me in moments. Without thinking, I ran. The village, or what remained of it, blurred around me as I sprinted toward the forest. My legs ached, my lungs burned. But I pushed forward, driven by a primal terror I had never known. The wind whipped against my face, and though I could no longer hear the scraping, I knew they were coming. They always were. My mind raced as I darted between the trees, trying to make sense of what I had seen. The Skaven, they weren't just a myth, a legend passed down to frighten children. They were real, far too real, and they were here, beneath our feet, digging, scraping, building something vast and terrible. Worse still, they had claimed an entire village, those people. Those poor souls, they had been reduced to nothing more than food and fodder for the verminous horrors below. The Skaven didn't just feed, they harvested. I stumbled, my foot catching on a root. I hit the ground hard, the breath knocked from my chest. For a moment, I lay there dazed, the taste of blood in my mouth. The forest around me was eerily still, the only sound my own ragged breathing. I had to keep moving. I had to escape. I pushed myself up, gritting my teeth against the pain in my legs, and staggered forward. My head pounded, and my vision swam, but I couldn't stop now. Not when I was so close to escaping. But then I heard it again. The scraping. It was faint at first, a distant whisper carried on the wind, but it grew louder with each passing second. I froze, my blood turning to ice. The noise wasn't coming from the hole this time. It was coming from the ground beneath me. I looked down, my heart hammering in my chest. The earth at my feet trembled, and I saw cracks forming in the soil, spurting outward like a web. The scraping grew louder, more frantic, and I realized with horror that they were tunneling toward me. I bolted, every instinct screamed at me to run, to put as much distance between myself and whatever was lurking below. The trees blurred past me, the forest a tangle of shadows and branches. The ground beneath me shifted, the cracks widening with every step. I could hear the Skaven now, their chittering laughter, their claws scraping at the stone just beneath the surface. They were hunting me, and they were closing in fast. I broke through the edge of the forest, stumbling into a clearing. The sky above was dark, clouds swirling in a storm that seemed to mirror the chaos in my mind. I had no idea where I was heading, but anywhere was safer than here. I had to reach the Empire. I had to warn them of the horrors beneath our feet. The Skaven were not just scavengers, they were an army, preparing to rise. But then, as I reached the far edge of the clearing, the ground gave way beneath me. I fell, tumbling into darkness. The air rushed past me, cold and sharp, as the earth swallowed me whole. I hit the ground hard, the impact sending a shock of pain through my body. For a moment I couldn't move. My head spun, and I struggled to breathe, my lungs aching from the fall. The scraping was deafening now. The Skaven were close, too close. I forced myself up, every muscle screaming in protest. The tunnel I had fallen into was narrow, the walls close and suffocating. but I could see faint light ahead, a way out, perhaps. I limped forward, the sound of claws scraping against stone growing louder with every step. My mind raced, trying to come up with a plan, but there was no time. I had to escape. I had to survive. The tunnel opened up into a wider cavern, and there, in the dim light of my lantern, I saw them, dozens of Skaven, hunched and twisted, their red eyes glowing in the darkness. They were everywhere, scurrying across the walls, digging, scraping, building. In the center of the chamber, a massive pit yawned open, and from its depths, a green glow pulsed, like a heartbeat, warpstone. I could feel its corrupting energy in the air, thick and heavy. The Skaven turned toward me as one, their eyes narrowing, their claws twitching. They had found me. I ran, my legs barely carrying me forward, my lungs burning with every breath. The Skaven swarmed behind me, their chittering laughter echoing through the tunnels, and I could feel them closing in, their claws scraping against the stone, their breath hot on my neck. Ahead, I saw a sliver of light, a way out. The tunnel narrowed, but I forced myself through, my body scraping against the jagged walls. The Skaven were right behind me, their claws inches from my heels. I burst out into the open air, collapsing onto the ground. The storm had broken, rain pouring down in sheets. The Skaven didn't follow. They lingered at the edge of the hole, their red eyes glowing in the darkness, watching me. Waiting. I scrambled to my feet, my body trembling with exhaustion. I had escaped, but the danger wasn't over. The Skaven were still down there, digging, plotting, waiting for the right moment to strike. And now, I knew the truth. They weren't just beneath the village. They were beneath the Empire. I turned and ran, the sound of scraping claws still echoing in my ears.